Yeah, so the assumption that ties together the text is the exercise of listening to space and context. In your practice, what does it mean to listen to a place?
Well, it means many things. I think first and foremost, thinking of place as not empty, or space as not as an empty, vessel. That a given site or a space that's created or a place is always very loaded with stories that are there, that are visible, that are not visible, that are kind of connected to other stories, or also connected to other containers like bodies. So, or libraries, or, histories. So I think, considering in my work how I treat place and space and site, is that there is always something that relates to the work, or that the work can use. So for me, since a few years ago, after graduating and training as an actor, and then finishing my master's, and my master's was really around relearning that the theater, for example, is not just a place with a stage where we come and sit, but rather it's so loaded. Backstage, a lot happens. There's been other things and many stories, and many politics in the theater. And I find that stuff is always useful, and it makes work richer, because it's not just, you're not just treating the space as the space which you're occupying, but also kind of how the space occupies you. So listening, in terms of listening, I think that's what it requires. So if we look at place or landscape or site or space as a text, as a thing that contains knowledge, then I think that the process of making work often requires listening to that space. I work a lot in the sound and sonic spaces, creating sound, and thinking a lot about how sound is this moving thing that has no boundaries, has no borders, but also how every place has its own kind of sound and sounds. But also listening to things that are not audible, but rather, what does it mean to listen visually? To listen to a visual. What does it mean to listen to silence? Things like that. So I'm very interested in concepts of usefulness of space and place.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I also think that when you work with archives, there's a lot of, I mean, how you approach history has a lot to do with listening, no? To listening to different places of memory, of trauma. So I guess, yeah, it's like listening with the whole body to a place and give space to all those sounds unheard many times, like to be audible, no, in a certain way. Another question that I thought, I mean, which you explained thoroughly in your text, but I think it can be very interesting for people to know in these small videos that we will show, is you depict cultural institutions as concentration camps in your text. Could you elaborate on your choice to use this metaphor a bit? Can you explain the relationship between cultural institutions and concentration camps?
So just to say that I wrote that paper in 2017. It was part of a conference, and then I developed it further for this publication. And so it's interesting also for me that I saw, and I still see, cultural institutions as some sort of concentration camp. And by that correlation really has to do a lot with, if we think about capitalism and how institutions in general, not just cultural institutions, but institutional, and their bureaucracies is very, 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 very implicated in like violence, institutional violence, or in fact, it is what creates the institutional violence, or what we call systemic violence. And for me, the idea of a concentration is also conceptual there, by really saying that, for example, in our training as artists, as performers and actors and so forth, there's a lot of valuing of concentration. Concentration that is useful for us to focus, because it's important for us to focus. But if sometimes you read into the details of this concentration, you'll realize that it's also a one-dimensional concentration, right? So it's not a split focus. It's not a split concentration. Mm-hmm. It's one particular culture that you are being taught, which has a whole legacy, which is colonialism, which is now translated in all kinds of things, neo-colonialism, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, so concentration goes there. But then I speak also broadly to our history, because I come from a country where we have histories of concentration camps, where people were punished for being rebellious to the colonial system, and they were put in concentration camps with hard labor, That memory does not end there. That memory is very tied, and it's in fact what makes up the institution today, because it is that culture, the culture of superiority, that one culture is more superior than the other, or one race is more superior than the other, that is continued, whether it's in our art schools, or it's in our theaters or museums, or there is still it's not plural, it's very hierarchical, very bureaucratic, and that's why we're continuously facing issues of exclusion and issues of excess, not enough excess. And that's really what I mean by concentration, and the problems and the dangers, the violence of concentration.
Yeah. And very connected to what you're saying, I was thinking that if we assume that cultural institutions such as galleries and museums, archives, are part of this systemic violence, how do you imagine we could deal with memory, trauma, and heritage from a feminist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial perspective, or a transversal anti-systemic perspective?
Yeah. That question is very hard to answer, but it's also easy to answer. But also today, in this time of Corona, COVID-19, I'm also very wondering, like, what is the answer? And what are the answers? I think part of that work has always meant then still being in that concentration camp, in that institution, and working closely with it. And in order to transform the situation. A few years ago, I would have told you probably that no, you can't do much. You can only do, and yes, we can only do as much. We can only, you know, there's something very stubborn and very static about an institution. But we are in the institution, right? We are in the university. I think it would be very pretentious of us to say, yeah, it will never change, right? Because then what are we doing in the institution? So I think at the moment, what we are even being shown as civil society or as activists or as artists is to work more close now with government in this pandemic, is to work more close with those historically oppressive, at least this is where I am, this is how I'm understanding it, and negotiating. So if you have the stamina and the courage and the energy, because it does require energy, then this is, I think, one strategy is to work closely. The other strategy is to continue connecting the margins with the center. Connecting the margins with the center, making that connection and allowing people to meet each other, because people don't meet each other. People don't know, you know. So for me, public education, whether it's feminist education, whether it's queer education, whether it's Pan-Africanist education, whether it's indigenous education, Marxist education, it's all very important. Because I think the thing that we are fighting for, which is love, is really a human thing. It's not just a black thing. It's not just a global South thing. It's a human thing that we all deserve to experience. So I think we should develop different strategies, and one of those strategies is to work very closely with, like for example, I'm a man, but as a feminist man, I often tell myself you have to do the work of sitting around other men and bringing up these conversations of patriarchy and what does it mean and what is our responsibility. It would be very pretentious for me to just cut out that group entirely. But although sometimes it's necessary to distance yourself.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to me, especially this idea of of the encounters, no, which connects a lot with what art can also do. Sometimes it can generate encounters that otherwise could not happen because there's a lot of like stereotypes or fears or just a lot of history that keeps separating people, no, instead of bridging instead of bridging them. You pose a question that I found really interesting in your article, especially in the context of Mexico, no? And you say, what can we learn from indigenous archives? And maybe to I don't know, to complement it, is it possible to work with, can indigenous archives give us some hints on how museums and cultural institutions can work and think themselves in terms of restorative justice?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. What can we learn from indigenous archive? I think the question takes me to my PhD work, which partly deals with notions of indigenous archives through the body embodiment, body encounter. But what I think might be a very interesting approach, and what we might find really interesting, is the idea of indigenous concepts. right? So any idea that constitutes as an indigenous concept, like for example, in my work, in my PhD work, I'm looking for indigenous, well, I'm studying one particular indigenous concept of performance, which is Audano, which means play, but I'm also looking for the different translations. I found the different words, the different translations, and how they all refer to that broad spectrum of performance, for example, which, for example, is interdisciplinary, because once we say Audano, we can refer to dance, we can refer to theater, we can refer to ritual, we can refer to music, we can refer to, you know, community, culture. And these are the things that indigenous archives can teach us. But we mustn't think of them as things that are in the far past or things that are primitive. We have to think of them as things that we already embody. So indigenous archives, for example, are in our museums. Those very many collections, those are our archives, our baskets. In theaters around the world, people use a lot of what they call folk, you know, or whatever labels they put on it. Those are, so we have to look across the board. It's not something that's stuck in the far past, but rather it's something that we experience because we are all indigenous to nature or the world. And I think I can answer that question from that perspective of performance and art and culture, that its indigeneity is something that we experience and something that we hold, or at least something that we interact with, if we now don't want to identify with indigeneity. It is also something that is around us.